Thank you. Thank you very much, and welcome. I'm Father Mitch Pacwa, and welcome to Threshold of Hope, where we take a look at the writings of the Church. And we are in the encyclical Veritatis Splendor. Now, you can get a copy of this in a couple of ways. One, you can go to EWTN's Religious Catalog. Website is ewtnrc.com. Or you can call them, 1-800-854-6316. And you can order a paperback copy of the encyclical there. If you prefer, you can download a free electronic copy of Veritatis Splendor in the document web library. Go to our website, ewtn.com. You'll see Faith up there, top, click that. Then you'll see Document Library, click that. Type in Veritatis Splendor, and you can download the document into your computer and read along with this from your computer or print it out. Now, of course, we love having you get involved and participate in the show. You can do what these nice folks have done from different parts of the country, as far away as Arizona and New Jersey, as well as Tennessee and Michigan. And we'd love to have you come here to our studios in beautiful Irondale, Alabama. Good to have you here. And another option is to send us a question to the email address, threshold@ewtn.com, or call during the live broadcast. If you're in North America, the phone number is 1-800-221-9460. Or if you are outside North America or inside Birmingham area, call 205-271-2980. All right, today we begin chapter 3, the third and final chapter of this encyclical. We'll take a while with it, but he begins with a quote from St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where he says, "Lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." And then explains that the name of this chapter 3 is Moral Good for the Life of the Church and of the World. He's going to bring out very strongly that this call to morality will not only be for the church, but also for the whole world. It's good for everyone. So let's begin with paragraph 84. Now this paragraph also begins with another quote about one of the main issue we've been talking about, which is the relationship between freedom and the law of God. So he quotes from Galatians chapter 5, verse 1, where St. Paul wrote, "For freedom, Christ has set us free." And that's going to be a key thing for him, that Christ sets us free so that we become capable of living in true freedom. So let's take a look at that. He begins this section by saying that the fundamental question that we're dealing with in the previous chapter 2 of this encyclical comes from, the question comes from the moral theories that we have. And those moral theories that we've been looking at, various modern moral theories of how to state that something is right or wrong, they are trying to deal with the relationship between human freedom and God's law. So we saw that again and again, trying to deal with the question of human freedom versus the law of God. Does the law of God impose itself on human freedom? That's a question for a lot of people. And then there's ultimately a bigger question behind that. What is the relationship between human freedom and truth? And that is a question that many in our society are particularly afraid of. That is key. Because they have major doubts that truth exists or is knowable. Now, he goes back to something that he had taught back in 1986, I think it was, April 1986. He gave an address to the International Congress of Moral Theology in April 1986. And in paragraph 1, and you can get that, by the way, from our documents library as well. But in paragraph 1, it says, only the freedom which submits to the truth leads the human person to his true good. The good of the person is to be found in the truth and to do the truth. Now, this is something every one of us should say, well, that makes sense. For a lot of people outside of faith, it doesn't. But for those of us who have what we like to call down here in Alabama, walking around sense, the sense of how to walk around the world, this makes good sense. Give you an example. You are free in the sense of license to believe anything you want about 2 plus 2. But if you want to get correct change at the store, it better add up to 4. The right answer is 4. Does saying, well, every time you have 2 plus 2 that it equals 4, does that limit your freedom? Well, if you mean by your license to think whatever you want, yes. If you say, well, I want a more creative approach towards math. I want 2 plus 2 to equal 10 so that they give me more for my money. But you'll find out soon enough that if you keep up with that attitude, they might be even more creative and say that 2 plus 2 equals 1 in our store, so you don't get any change. No. Your freedom to understand mathematics means you know the truth. Your freedom in relationship to gravity is to know the truth about gravity, which pulls you to gravitational centers. So that if you are trying to fly off of a building without any means of propulsion, gravity will win, and that's the truth. You will fall. So, knowing the truth about math and science gives you more freedom to survive in a large building or in a store where you're getting change. But that also applies to the issues of morality. Knowing the truth and seeking to do the truth, simply because it's true, will give us greater freedom than seeking to come up with our own notions. A comparison between the church's teaching and the social and cultural situation today immediately makes clear the urgent need for the church to develop an intense pastoral effort precisely with regard to this fundamental question about the relationship between truth and freedom. Do we not see that people are harming one another with no apparent reason? When you say, well, I have freedom to shoot, stab, or club anybody I feel like, does that give us more freedom? Do you have a freedom when you do that to walk inside a police station without any nervousness? No, you lose that freedom. And do other people gain freedom by people coming along and killing innocent folk on the street? What does that do to the freedom of everybody else in an area? They stay at home. They become afraid to walk the streets. You rob them of their freedom if you exercise a certain licentiousness to do violence anywhere you want on the street. That's reality. That's reality. If people obeyed the commandments, thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not steal, and shall not commit adultery and or rape, people could have more freedom to walk on our streets any time of day or night. As it is, they don't have that freedom. So the Pope then speaks about the essential bond, in the same letter, the essential bond between truth, the good, and freedom has been largely lost sight of by our present day culture. They don't see that you are free to seek the good or truth. They want to say you're free to express yourself. And often as a result, I said this, I've used this example before, talking to a young man selling hot dogs at the airport, long before my heart attack, by the way. And and one of the things, I asked, well, what are you doing besides selling hot dogs? I said, well, I'm an art student. I said, good. Make sure you seek beauty. I said, no, I want to express myself. I said, don't. Express what is beautiful. And you will be much better off than if you try to express yourself. If you express yourself, it'll end up being ugly art. Express what is beautiful and true. That's your goal. He said, oh, I don't want it. I said, don't give me that. As a result of our culture having lost the link between freedom, goodness, and truth, helping man to rediscover it represents the specific requirements of the church's mission. This is our task today. And it's a task for the salvation of the world. He mentions Pontius Pilate's question in John chapter 19. When he's standing before Jesus, remember at the Last Supper, Jesus said, I am the truth. In the praetorium, standing before Jesus, Pontius Pilate asks, well, what is truth? And the Pope shows this, as he says, the distressing perplexity of a man who often no longer knows who he is, which is the situation of a lot of modern people. They don't know whence they come, where people come from, what was their origin, and where are they going? Pontius Pilate didn't understand that any more than many modern people. Hence, we not infrequently, so very frequently we witness the fearful plunging of the human person into situations of gradual self-destruction. How many times in the news do we hear about people killing a bunch of relatives, including innocent children, before they commit suicide? This is a pattern. It's not happened once. You say, oh, that's terrible. But it becomes a pattern. How many times do we hear about people who become addicted to meth? And after they become addicted to meth, blow themselves up because these meth labs are so dangerous. Or people today who become addicted to heroin. Heroin is cheaper than beer today. It's easier to get that than a package of beer. And every day we see that it's well over 100 and some people who die of drug overdoses in this country every day. We see the self-destruction of people who are in the drug trade at various levels. And in Mexico, it's about 10,000 people a year who die from the drug trade. Because when they use drugs, they lose any sense of clarity of thought. So they don't care about what is true. They care about what they want. And they don't care about what is good. The drugs have ruined the capacity for the good. And those who use drugs in this country need to be reminded again and again that 10,000 people in Mexico are dying so that they can have their evil habit. They ought never to forget that. This is something that we have to see about this, what he means by this fearful plunge into self-destruction. In my book on fighting against sin, or winning the battle against sin, it's called, I mentioned how when the demons are in the Gerasene demoniac, and Jesus is casting them out, they know they can't stand up against Jesus. So they say, send us into the pigs. And what happens? They kill the pigs. They drive the pigs over the bluff. I know the bluff. I've been there dozens of times over the years. It's the only bluff on the Sea of Galilee. That's how you know it. And they drown themselves. This is what the communists did to their own society in the name of their atheism. This is what the Nazis did to their society. This is what Japan, in the name of its nationalism, did to its own society. This is what corrupt politicians in this country do to their cities and counties, as we see all over. They are self-destructive. According to some people, it appears that one no longer need acknowledge the enduring absoluteness of any moral value. You'll have people all over our media. Hollywood makes this their theme. They don't believe that there is any moral value. And what they are promoting is that everybody else live the way they do. Typically, these producers, not the actors necessarily, but look to the producers to see whether or not they are doing this kind of living out of something that then they put into their movies. And we see this contempt for human life after conception and before birth. I listened just the other day on National Public Radio. I'm tempted to call it Nationalist People's Radio, but no, it's National Public Radio. And here there was a woman who was all upset the other day on her show because a lady had gone over to a crisis pregnancy consulting place, and they would not recommend abortion. And she was just outraged that they would not recommend abortion and waste her time. And then they had her at the end. Well, she got the abortion and she's self-satisfied. This is promoted by people in various parts of the media. We see an ongoing violation of the basic rights of the person. We've mentioned a number of times, especially when I did that section on slavery. Today we see more slaves in our world than there were in the 1700s and 1800s. But they're sexual slaves, doing pornography and prostitution in slavery. This is an attack on their basic rights to have freedom, so that some guys and gals might have freedom to express their sexuality anytime they want. They are willing to allow sex slaves, people who are being brought over from Mexico. They had that just on the other day on National Geographic. People, some women are having to pay for their journey from Mexico here as illegal immigrants by being sex slaves, and nobody tells them when they're paying it up. They just keep using them. Same thing with people coming in from Eastern Europe, and it's all over Asia. We see the unjust destruction of goods that are minimally necessary for human life. We see injustices to workers, where people's stuff is destroyed. Indeed, something very serious has happened. Human beings are no longer convinced that only in the truth can they find salvation. No, they think they can make up their own truth. And when they, just like when they make up their own truth about 2 plus 2, when they make up their own truth about God, when they go around calling themselves spiritual, what they're looking for is foam and not substance. They want the foam and not the coffee, or the foam and not the beer, depending what you drink. Sorry, not to exclude the Mormons who don't drink either one, but it's a good image. People who say, I'm a spiritual person. I'm not a religious person. You're going for foam, and there's no depth. And this is the sense that we have. The saving power of the truth is contested by modern people. And they want freedom alone, uprooted from any objective reality. They just want freedom floating in the air, as if it were this so-called cloud that they have. And instead, we want to say that there is a truth that has to do with freedom. Everybody is left to decide for themselves what is good and evil. And this becomes absolute relativism. It becomes relativism in the field of theology, as in other areas. People distrust the wisdom of God about what is right and wrong. They don't believe that God guides people with a moral law. And concrete situations are unfavorably contrasted with the precepts of moral law. Well, what about my situation? I mean, God's law says I should not abort a baby. But do you realize that maybe if I carry the child to term, I'll be poor? Well, I know that if you don't carry the child to term, the child will be dead. So you're contrasting one alternative with another one for somebody else, and you disregard their rights. This is something where we need to get back to what God is asking of us. People do not maintain that the law of God is the one true good for all of humanity. Now, and if you think that is just a few people, take a look at the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has been making that law. There's a case back in the early 1990s. It's Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Casey was the governor of Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, they had a law saying that the father of a child has a right to know that the child exists, so that the mother of the child needs to inform the father of the existence of the child, and that if she goes to have an abortion, she needs to inform the father of the child that she's going to have an abortion. And the Supreme Court says, no, she does not have that right or obligation to inform a father that he's a father. He has no right, according to the Supreme Court, to know that he is now a dad. And he has no right to have any kind of say with the woman who's the mother of his child as to whether the child lives or dies. His right to protect the child is taken away from him by the Supreme Court. And in that decision, I urge you to look it up. You can find it online, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. And you'll see there that freedom gives the absolute right for every person to define themselves in any way that they see is good for the meaning of life as they determine it. So that this kind of freedom floating off in the atmosphere is not only something in the fluffy thought of silly Hollywood movies or evil Hollywood movies, and it's not only something that you see bantered around on talk television or radio. It is now something enshrined by the Supreme Court of the United States. And it is into this world that we are sent with a message that having the good and the true is not only necessary for freedom, but it is necessary for humans to live in a moral way. We're going to take a break. We'll come back in a couple of minutes. So please stay with us. We'll have some of your emails and questions, as well as questions from our studio audience. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, we want to invite you to come and join us. We love having folks come be part of the studio audience. If you do, please contact our pilgrimage department. The phone number for them is 205-271-2966. Or you can go to the website, www.ewtn.com, and they will give you information about the scheduling of masses, programs where you can be in the audience, and different places you can stay, and of course eat, because we want, especially some of these folks, the Tennesseans, they have good barbecue up there, but we want these folks from Arizona, and New Jersey, and Michigan to get some of that good Alabama barbecue, as well as have good places to stay. And they'll give you instructions on how to get up to Huntsville to pray up there with the sisters. So please come and join us. Let's start off with a question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
Hi, Father. I'm from Virginia.
Virginia. Good to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you. This is my circumstances right now. How will I help my friends understand about natural family planning? Because they're into that right now, and they're trying to convince me to do the same because I'm having more kids already without offending them.
So that now they're trying to convince you to do what?
Contraception.
So they're trying to convince you to commit the sin of contraception.
Yes, Father.
Yes. And you don't want to do that.
I don't want.
Okay. There are a couple things that you can do. Why do they want to tell you what to do?
Because they see that I already have 3 children, and I am like 14 months on the way also. And I think they're just concerned.
They're concerned about what?
Me, like, will have a hard time, like, raising kids. That they said that it's expensive to have kids right now.
Yeah, are they giving you the money to raise your children?
No.
Why are they worried about the way you spend your money?
Maybe they don't want me to.
Well, see, don't go maybe because you don't know. But that's one of the questions you may need to ask them. Why are you worried about how I spend my money? Precisely, what is that of your business? Do you not think my husband and I know what it costs to raise these children? And you have you probably have a better idea than they do. Correct?
Yes, Father.
Because you don't go giving them your list of bills, do you?
Oh, no.
No, of course. So they're guessing. And they have another issue. They're not giving you money. You're not asking them for money. Are you making them babysit?
No. I stay at home.
Oh, and so there is something else going on here, I suspect. And one of these days, matter of fact, you can say to them, one of these days, you're going to have a nicer car than I do, perhaps. You might have a nicer house. But your house will be empty. You can come over with my children and grandchildren and enjoy our house if you'd like. But I'd rather have the car is going to wear out before my kids wear me out.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes, Father.
And here's the other thing too, in terms of the inherent value at stake. What contraception does is say between a husband and wife or any other sexual partners, I will give you some of myself sexually. I'll give you part of my sexual existence. But the part that makes babies, no, I'm keeping that to myself. That's mine. Because I want other stuff to be mine. And I don't want to share with any kids. And what you're saying is, I'm giving my husband all of my femininity, the fullness of it. I bestow that on him, and he gives me the fullness of his masculinity. This is where a husband and wife are called upon to give themselves. People who use contraception are giving part, but I'm not giving you everything. This is key to understanding. And there are a lot of there's a lot more factors too that go into that about how that changes the way, because the physical changes between, especially what goes on when a woman uses the contraceptive pill, the changes inside her body due to the hormonal changes have a lot of side effects that even affect the interest that a husband has in his wife. Because there are certain pheromones that he no longer detects because of that. Her body is tricking her. And but you can study more of that. All right, we have a question caller in. Hello, Mike.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Hey.
you, Father.
Yeah, where are you from?
I'm from Stony Point, New York.
Good to have you.
I've spoken to you once or twice before. I can't thank you enough for taking my call.
My pleasure.
Father, I'm an agnostic with strong atheistic tendencies, but despite that, I still enjoy your program. I can't tell you how much I like you.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. I'm honored.
Thank you, sir. I'm honored for taking a call. Father Pedro told a couple of women that their husbands were going to. He told them that their husbands were going to hell. Mm-hmm. This I'm sure of. I've heard it from Father Gretches years ago.
It sounds like something he might say.
My question, Father, can someone be truly happy in heaven? My question is, can someone be truly happy in heaven if a loved one of theirs they know is in hell? Mm-hmm. Please answer slowly and pure language, understandable language. Mm-hmm. Can someone be truly happy in heaven if a loved one they know is in hell?
Here's something that we would say absolutely yes. It does, because here's why. A couple things. First, the fact that somebody they love is in hell does not diminish the love that the person in heaven feels. They still have that love for that other person. They know that the other person is not able to reciprocate, because one of the issues for the folks in hell is that they are incapable of loving anyone else. I've heard people say to me, well, I want to go to hell because I know all my friends will be there. Yeah, well, that may be true. I don't know. But I can tell you this for sure. They will no longer be your friends. They will hate you, especially if you had encouraged them to commit the sins that got them there. they will hate you all the more. Not at all unlike some of the people I've known who've gone to jail, who hate the people that got them involved in a botched up crime that got them into prison. They're really angry at them. Why'd you make me do this? Well, you did say yes. And that's one of the issues, that the person in hell bears the full brunt of personal responsibility for doing the evil that gets them there. And the person in heaven, will not have the joy of heaven taken away from them by hell. In other words, hell will not have the ability to veto happiness in heaven. See, that's one of the problems that would take place if you said, oh, I can't enjoy heaven without my beloved, because at that point, hell ends up putting a veto on joy in heaven. And hell doesn't get that power. That's a very important thing. In other words, and I've heard this question many times before, because people are, in one sense, thinking that, and maybe even hoping, that hell will be able to veto heaven, and it won't. That the joy of heaven will be the completion of the purpose of existence. And while they would love to have all those in hell up there, they will not lose their joy because of the choice of others. And that'll be the reality. All right, we have an email from Joe. Hello, Father Mitch. How literal is the church's interpretation of Genesis, where it says that God formed man out of the clay of the ground? Along the same lines, how literal is the church's interpretation of the story of Noah, where the Bible says Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters came upon the earth? Joe from Baltimore. These are two kind of questions. We have to approach it with the help of Pope Pius's encyclical back from the 1940s. I think it was about 42. It's called Divino Afflante Spiritu. And one of the things that he does, using a principle by St. Augustine, is that you take a look at these things that we see and try to understand them in the context of the way the ancient people wrote and spoke. Now, let's start off in one sense with the age, because the ages of the different patriarchs in Genesis have a certain complexity to them in this sense. Do you know how in Roman numerals, what are Roman numerals? Letters of the Roman alphabet, right? The numbers we use are from India. They came to us by the Arabs. We call them Arabic numerals, but they're actually from India. But the Romans had used letters of their alphabet. So did the ancient Israelites. And even still in a Bible I have printed in Hebrew from Israel, the page numbers are letters of the alphabet. See, they don't have alphabet. Alphabet is Greek. But alphabet is the Hebrew first two letters. Okay? And so all the numbers, so Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel 3, Dalet 4, and so on. And you go on with the other letters after Yod to get to 10 places and 100 places and so on. Well, those numbers therefore spell out words. And if I ever retire, one of the things I would like to do is take those numbers and see what they spell out. I just haven't done that. To me, other projects have been more important. But that's it's clearly some sort of a code. And this is something that, if you're interested, Father Bruce Vaughter, in his book on Genesis, takes a look at it, mentions that he hasn't done it either, and he died. I may as well before I get a chance to do it, but that would be something that maybe some graduate student would like to do. In terms of God forming man out of the clay, and then adding the line from ashes to, to ashes and dust to dust, and saying that out of the dirt you were made, and the name Adam, comes from the word for ground, Adamah. So they're showing that link. Why? Because on one hand, God gives man his spirit. On the other hand, the human being comes from the earth. Now, is it literally that God is making mud pies into the shape of human beings? Okay? It wouldn't be mud, it'd be clay. Not mud, clay. And the church gives us freedom to accept that that literally happened, where God forms, but it also allows people to have another understanding that God created the human beings out of the materials of this earth that came about in other ways. And some people prefer to hold positions that based on evolutionary models, and the church gives permission to accept that, so long as we understand that the gap in between irrational animals and the true human being, which anthropologists say goes back to somewhere between 180 and 200,000 BC, that gap is something that God did by giving a human spirit that is different than what the animal soul is. The church insists on that. You see that again in Humanae Generis by Pope Pius XII. But you have a certain freedom to accept either one of those. And so that's something that is, as far as doctrine goes, the freedom, because you're still talking about coming from the earth. Just God forming humans out of the earth in two different ways. One is a formation of clay directly, and the other is the development from clay and other materials over many millennia. So you have freedom as far as that goes. All right, let's now go to Eliana in Texas. Hello, Eliana. What part of Texas do you live in?
Hello.
Hi. Where are you from in Texas?
In San Antonio, Texas.
San Antonio. Make sure you turn off your television, okay, or turn it down, okay? Because I'm hearing myself back again. Once is enough, if not too much. So, Eliana, what's your question? I'm hearing myself back again. Once is enough, if not too much. I think she's off there turning off the TV.
My question is, should I worry that my children and grandchildren... Hello?
Yeah, I'm listening.
Should I worry that
I hear you.
grandchildren are offending God? They're offending God, and
What are they doing to offend God?
and they think that they have the right to choose whatever they believe.
Uh-huh. Well, you can tell them that's true, and that when they die, God will have a choice as to whether they go to heaven or hell, based on what they believe. So long as they understand that, sure, you have your free choice. That's where you have free will. But God also will have a free choice about you staying with the truth or not. And Eliana, one of the things that I would urge is that you let them know God, made flesh, Jesus Christ, says that He is the truth. And that they ought not to think that they can hold any opinion they want, even when it contradicts the truth of who Jesus Christ is. And then that they'll like heaven. If they want to have their own personal truth about God, then they would not like heaven, where the truth is demanded, and they will get what they wish. All right, we have another question from our studio audience. Ma'am, where are you from?
Michigan,
Michigan. What, over in the eastern part?
Dearborn Heights.
Yeah, that's east. So what's your question?
If a person leaves the Catholic Church because they don't believe in the teachings of the Catholic Church, and they go to a church where they believe in those teachings, when they die, how will they be judged? By the teachings of the Catholic Church or the other church?
Here's going to be one of the things. God will judge them in accord with the state of their conscience. Now, let me give a couple of nuances. For instance, if somebody leaves the Catholic Church because they find that Catholic teaching is no longer convenient, and they say, well, I don't want to live like that, and the church is telling me that I'm wrong about what I'm doing morally or immorally, usually, and so I'll find a church that accepts the kind of immorality I want to live, okay? If that's why they leave the church, they will be judged on the basis of the truth that they abandoned. On the other hand, if for some reason a person was told, sometimes, usually falsely, that something that the Catholic Church did or teaches goes against their conscience, okay? So, for instance, you'll hear people say, we use it many times, people say, well, the Catholic Church causes more wars than anybody else. I don't want to be part of an organization that causes war, okay? And they leave because they are told something false. They don't know how to find out the facts that the Catholic Church is not the biggest cause of war in history by any stretch of the imagination, but selfish people are, and especially atheists are. But they don't have a way to get a hold of that. God will judge them by having said, okay, they want the truth of the peace of Christ. They were falsely told that the Catholic Church was against the peace of Christ, so they leave it. Or some other reason. The Catholic Church teaches you got to save yourself, which it doesn't. But they don't know how to find that. Then, if it's through no fault of their own, they don't find out what the church actually taught. They're trying, they didn't get to it, but they were given something false and they believed it, so then they follow it because they're trying to follow a good point, a good truth, to the best of their ability, and they're really honestly seeking, then our Lord will judge them by that, okay? And that's a very important distinction. Whereas people who just leave because I'm not going to follow the rule, go back to what this lady was saying before, everybody I know does contraception, and I feel I should too, so there, and they just leave because it's not convenient. Or how can the church tell me that fornication, sex before marriage, is wrong? I don't care what they say. At that point, you'll be judged by having gone for convenience instead of truth. It makes sense? Yep. So I have another caller. Hello, Mary?
Hi, Father.
Hi, where are you calling from?
I'm from Toronto.
Oh, great. Toronto,
and I
Canada.
must say thank you for all your help in teaching us about our wonderful faith.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. We got to do what we can. What's your question today, Mary?
Yes. How would you answer someone who believes that you don't need church or God to be good? That there are many people outside the church or don't believe in God who are good. How would you answer them?
Okay, a couple things, Mary. First of all, I would say, yes, there are many people who live outside of church who are good. But then go back into those people's lives. Very frequently, I find that they are outside the church now, but they had come from a religious background. They were taught Christian morality by parents who had once believed in it or still believed in it. And they are still living Christian morality, even though they don't accept the Christian basis. And my question will be, how long before the next generation loses any basis for being able to understand why things are right or wrong? So, in other words, they're like a bell, that when you ring a bell, you hear the sound. When you let go of the bell, it still rings a few times, and then you can't hear it. That's sort of what they have, the echoes of what they had once gotten. But when you take a look at the case I was mentioning before of, say, the atheists, when you see atheistic societies, such as Soviet Union and China, where they became responsible for the greatest widespread murder in the history of the world. Give an example. In terms of religious wars, 2.65 million people died in wars of Christianity over the last 2,000 years. Under the atheistic governments between 1914, World War I, to the end of the century, it's 305 million people were killed in wars and by their own government because they had no basis for giving people personal dignity, rights, and moral limitations on their government. And so the lack of the church is very important, and this is going to be another element. How many times do people, including Christians, know what is right and wrong and want to do what is right and avoid what is wrong and still find it very difficult? The reason is they need the grace of God to help them do what is good. And this is where you have a very important principle that we need the church as the means of grace so we can have an interior empowerment to do what is good and avoid what is wrong. Secondly, we need the church to help us think through the issues. One of the great things about the church is that it is 2,000 years old. And we have seen a wide variety of situations, more than any individual is capable of going through his or herself. None of us can go through all those experiences, nor should we. So with the experience of the church, we can learn some of the ways to think through difficult moral questions. So the church is there to be a teacher, and the church is there to be a mother that teaches us or empowers us to live a better life. And is it a struggle for everyone? Sure. The popes were all sinners, beginning with Peter, denied Christ and a lot of other foolish things. And the only sinless one in the church is the Blessed Mother. So we're dealing with sinners, but we're dealing with the fact that God pours out an abundance of grace to redeem all of those sinners and to guide them into what is good and true. And that is also the history of the church, as witnessed not by the wars, but by the numbers of saints of a wide variety of types and individuals. And that's where we see that we need the church. Plus, Jesus said so. That helps us. All right. Thank you very much. I want to give you a blessing. And mighty God bless you and keep you. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. And Mother Angelica established this network in such a way that it is brought to you by you. We always have depended on your support. So please keep us in between your gas bill, your electric bill, and your cable bill, and we will be able to pay all of our bills too, especially now in the summertime when you go on vacation. Thank you.